Think about what happens in the first few seconds you realize you are lost. Your heart rate spikes. Your scanning speeds up. The very word lost carries overtones of complete disaster. It triggers an acute, visceral anxiety. That panic is an ancient biological reflex. For early humans, navigation was a requirement for survival. Tribes in Central Australia had to memorize the exact subtle topography of tiny waterholes across miles of desert to escape drought, while South Sea Islanders learned to read star positions and ocean currents to cross the open sea. For our ancestors, possessing a precise mental map of the environment meant the difference between finding safety and dying from exposure. Our brains evolved to constantly seek out, process, and organize spatial cues from the world around us. Today, we navigate environments our ancestors couldn't have imagined. We move through massive concrete grids and towering, complex intersections, but our biology hasn't changed. We still rely on distinct, recognizable features to orient ourselves. When an urban landscape is entirely uniform or aggressively chaotic, it deprives us of those necessary cues. A sprawling, featureless suburb or a tangled maze of identical streets forces the brain to work overtime, inducing the same primal survival panic we feel in the trackless wilderness. In 1960, urban planner Kevin Lynch proposed a solution to this. He argued that to alleviate this modern disorientation, planners had to build legible cities, environments designed to deliberately provide the visual markers our ancient brains are searching for. A legible city is one where the physical parts are easy to identify and arrange into a coherent pattern. Citizens can absorb the layout quickly and construct a reliable mental map without constant, exhausting effort. Lynch identified 5 structural elements we use to build these mental maps. The most dominant of these are paths. These are the channels of movement, the streets, transit lines, and walkways where we spend most of our time traveling. When paths lack clear direction, our internal compass spins. Historical Scully Square in Boston demonstrates this. The irregular, sprawling plaza and uneven, converging streets force pedestrians and drivers to make constant, confusing choices. Compare that to a Los Angeles freeway. Despite the heavy traffic, the massive scale and continuous, uninterrupted flow firmly anchor the driver's sense of direction. The path itself becomes the strongest element in their mental geography. For paths to reduce cognitive load, planners give them a clear sense of progression. Subtle slopes, distinct lighting, or changing building textures along a route provide a predictable sequence that confirms a traveler is heading the right way. While paths carry us through the city, edges keep us contained. These are the linear breaks in continuity that we usually don't travel on, but use as lateral boundaries. Edges help our brains chunk massive amounts of spatial data. They slice an overwhelming, boundless expanse into digestible, manageable districts. The Charles River in Boston acts as a highly visible, continuous boundary. It sharply divides the dense urban development, giving residents a definitive stopping point that prevents their mental map from drifting aimlessly outward. By defining exactly where one region stops and the next begins, edges provide structural comfort. They act as the load-bearing walls of our mental map. With the paths laid out and the edges defined, the brain needs specific points to lock the grid in place. Lynch called these landmarks, external objects we use to gauge our position. Distant landmarks are prominent structures visible from afar. The Custom House Tower in Boston establishes a constant visual anchor. A driver on a chaotic street can spot the tower and immediately gauge their direction without seeing the surrounding streets. On a smaller scale, we rely on local landmarks. Unique neighborhood storefronts, specific mature trees, or even distinct doorknobs trigger familiar sequential memories along a daily neighborhood commute. A city becomes truly legible when these elements overlap. Navigable paths give us motion, strong edges provide borders, and prominent landmarks pin the entire system securely in our minds. When an urban environment successfully layers predictable paths, solid boundaries, and memorable points of reference, it achieves total visual clarity. This physical legibility directly neutralizes the biological panic of being lost. The brain stops frantically searching for cues and relaxes into a predictable, known space. An ordered, legible environment serves as a broad frame of reference. It grants its citizens profound emotional security, allowing them to interact with their surroundings rather than fight them. Replacing the fear of disorientation with the relief of immediate recognition provides a stable basis for individual growth. This clarity functions as a form of psychological infrastructure. Successful urban design translates the terrifying complexity of the megacity into the sweet, comforting sense of home. By building for the way we actually perceive, planners transform a concrete landscape into a lasting anchor for our lives.